Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
Hey everyone! So our last episode came in response to one of our listeners requesting a specific topic, and guess what? This one does too. So you know who you are. Thank you so much for interacting with us and providing this idea. And if you want us to do an episode on something that's near and dear to your heart or something that's a challenge that you're facing, let us know. Or, if you just want to say hi or provide some feedback or whatever, just get in touch with us. Go to indigotogether.com/contact. Again, that's indigotogether.com/contact. Our podcast grows most dramatically through the referrals we get from our listeners, and we truly are reaching an ever-increasing audience, but we really want that to continue, and we desperately need your help in that. So tell your friends about this podcast if you appreciate it, and maybe say something nice about us on social media, leave us a 5-star review, and write something on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And thank you so much. We are so thrilled to be providing this content for all of you, and we just want to continue making it grow.
Yeah, thank you, listeners. So today we're talking about creating a feedback culture. And, we'll lead off with, what is a feedback culture and why does it matter? Then we'll talk about what an organization can do to foster that feedback culture and what individual leaders can do to foster a feedback culture. So, Ben, what is a feedback culture and why should somebody give a rip?
Yeah. So first of all, let's just start with feedback itself. And feedback is, hearing about your performance or learning more about your behavior and how it impacts others. And feedback matters. The trick is that just due to the way we're wired, we aren't always that good as humans at knowing our strengths and weaknesses. We may think we do, and we can kind of have some ideas around it, but there is a degree of variance between people in terms of how self-aware they are. And
right. This is like the whole Johari window, right? Sorta, right? We have some items that are known to others, but not known to us in our life. And if you don't have any feedback, and feedback comes a variety of ways, just like people's body, you get in front of a group of people and they start making disgusted faces, that, oh man, like, do I have ketchup on my blouse or something?
or they start falling asleep or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I mean, not having any feedback is like putting a blindfold on and just walking on a crowded highway, right? You gotta have it.
Yeah. Especially in new situations. Right. So when we're doing something new that's unfamiliar to us, maybe our team, maybe our organization, maybe even our family, we're going through something that we haven't done before. This may start to reveal some of your personal weaknesses as a leader.
Ouch.
Yeah. At a time when it really probably matters, right? And so, part of performing well in those new situations is receiving the feedback that you're getting from those around you, and then actually taking that feedback and adapting as necessary.
Right.
So there is a formal way in which many organizations do this, right?
Yeah, the performance review.
Performance review. Yeah, which of course, is a mixed bag. And, performance appraisals, performance reviews, those are those annual evaluations that many organizations do on all their employees and so forth, talking about what you did well and maybe what you didn't do well that year. Interested listeners should go back and listen to our episode we did a while back titled The Performance Review, More Harm Than Good? ? So there's a link to that in our show notes. Go check that out. We talk all about performance appraisals, but this is one way in which organizations try to formalize or at least ensure that there is some feedback happening with regard to performance in the workplace. But there's more to that.
Right. And, organizations, we as people that care about human flourishing, we want people to grow and develop. A lot of a lot of companies that we go into, they just want to buy a perfect one off the shelf. We need a new director of IT. Where's the perfect one? They have the technical skills. They have the cycle set. Oh, here's a good one. We'll just take that off the shelf. But nobody, even if you do find the best one on the shelf, so to speak, is perfect. And you've got to develop people if you want to adopt a best practice stance of how to run an organization.
That's very true. And there's just so much more to feedback than the piece of paper or some sort of online performance review system. If we truly want people to develop, if we truly want to help people know what they're doing well and what they need to work on and so forth. Now, some of this stuff around feedback and accepting feedback and creating a feedback or coaching culture runs contrary to what a lot of us think about, kind of our natural theories, what we call implicit theories about leadership. So we kind of, through our growing up, maybe some of our early career experiences, we developed kind of these ideas around what leaders do, what leadership looks like. That person is a leader, that person isn't a leader, and so forth. And some of what we're going to talk about here today with regard to feedback and coaching kind of runs contrary to that. So for example, some ideas that perhaps I have had at various points through the past couple decades, and they are definitely not what I really think anymore, but some implicit theories I've had that run contrary to some of the stuff around feedback include things like leaders must be always decisive,
Yeah.
or leaders need to always have the final say about something. Leaders are always the people who know everything. It's not really true.
Right. And this is kind of, the stuff that we see all the time is people say, this is how I should behave in this situation, or their view of their own way they conduct their lives within an organization or out on the planet isn't very sense and respond. It's more, well, this is the way I am, or I'm being true to myself, or there's a myriad of pop business psychology books that are based on nothing other than a catchy title. So I'd say most of this, leaders actually aren't intentional about studying leadership, right? Or they're not very purposeful with choosing mentors and those kinds of things that would give them a broad perspective. They may pick one mentor, and then that mentor just kind of happened to fit the situation that they were in and were successful. But, if we learn anything, is situations and environments change, and successful leaders are adaptable. Now, that doesn't mean that they are a chameleon, but they are able to sense and respond. And one thing that we can do to help our leaders within organizations and more broadly in culture writ large is by having some kind of way of providing some feedback so they can self-correct and develop.
Very well said. And, part of that system or that environment that can create, a situation in which people are more likely to give feedback, to receive that feedback, it has to do a lot with the culture and climate of the organization. And in particular, in today's episode, we're focusing on this idea of a feedback environment, which is kind of what it's referred to in a lot of the scholarly literature on this, and I think it's a really good way to think about it. But you can also think of this as a feedback culture. We're going to kind of use feedback culture and feedback environment synonymously in this episode. You could also think of this as a coaching culture. The idea being that this is an environment in which people are giving good feedback, that they're receiving good feedback, and that it's actually useful for them with regard to their performance.
Right. So a lot of this stuff comes from Paul Levy from the University of Akron. Paul, if you happen to listen to the Indigo podcast, we'd love to have you on.
For sure. And given that he's not too far from where I am here in Northeast Ohio as well, we might be able to make that happen. And, so he's done a ton of research on performance appraisal and feedback in general, and this idea of a feedback environment. And one article that he and some co-authors wrote a while back that I think is really helpful is this article that was published in the journal Educational and Psychological Measurement, which he wrote. So Lisa Steelman was the lead author on that, and she wrote this with Paul and Andrea Snell. And what I like about this article is, so this was an article in which they were doing a study to try to develop a measure of this idea of a feedback environment. And in psychology and in education and other types of social science, when you're trying to measure something via a questionnaire or a survey or a test, one of the things you have to do is figure out what the heck you're talking about first, right?
Yep,
and
that would be a good idea.
Yeah, and so we have a fancy phrase for that. We call that construct definition. Trying to say, what is this thing? How is it distinct from other things that are like it? And then we try to come up with some ways in which we can capture that, maybe via some survey items, and we have a bunch of people take it. We look at the statistics around how people respond to that and other related things, and that gives us an idea of how we can measure things. It also gives us an idea of what this idea is, and so that's what they did in this article. And what's cool, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this a little bit, is they start off this article talking about how, look, feedback doesn't always work.
Yeah, because you never listen, Ben.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How's that for some feedback?
I disagree. So they talk about in the beginning of the article. They cite some research suggesting that more than 38% of the effects of feedback are actually negative. Right?
No wonder people are scared of feedback. Right?
Yeah. I mean, if those are just not great odds. And so, just saying in an organization, we're going to give more feedback, we're going to do this more. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And this is frequently misunderstood. We need to be thinking a little bit more broadly about the context and the environment in which this occurs, so that we can minimize these negative outcomes of feedback. So for example, if you give someone feedback in a way that isn't appropriate, it can create a lot of defensive-ness. It can actually make the person maybe double down on their current behavior, because maybe, for example, if you get some feedback from somebody who you don't really trust, and you don't really think that they're a credible source, you're not going to do that. You're going to say, you know what, well, that person's all jacked up themselves. I'm not going to do what they said, and I'm going to just keep doing what I'm doing, or maybe even do it more, right?
Right, or maybe they're like, I don't like this, and I have options, and quit. Right?
Yeah. So, feedback is a tricky thing, and this feedback environment piece, I think, is just so central to creating a good culture, as well as creating, if you want to have people who are actually coaching each other within an organization, it's very important. So let's get into this idea of this feedback environment. Again, I'm using that synonymously with feedback culture. And, this has to do very broadly. This is how they define it in the article, and I'm quoting, the contextual aspects of day-to-day supervisor, subordinate, and coworker feedback processes, rather than to the formal performance appraisal feedback session. So we're not talking about, when you sit down with somebody getting your formal performance review feedback, maybe that once a year or maybe twice a year type thing, where they say, here's your piece of paper that we're going to send to HR and let's go over this. We're not talking actually about that. And we're actually focusing more exclusively on the two different sources of feedback, being your supervisor and your coworkers. Now, obviously, feedback from subordinates, even if you're a leader and you have, people working for you, you're a manager of others, that type of feedback really does matter too. But just for the purposes of our conversation today, we're talking about feedback from supervisors and feedback from other coworkers.
Right. So, and this is like one of those negative or opposite type things. If you don't provide feedback in the day-to-day, that lack of provision of feedback is a type of feedback. Right? So like
it is.
If you're the supervisor and you're handing out tasks day to day and not telling anybody how they're doing on it, any of the deliverables they got to give you, and then you just wait for that formal performance review, no wonder you're nervous. Mm-hmm. you haven't practiced, you haven't built, well, some of the things we'll talk about, a quality moment, so that you have unintentionally curated a type of feedback culture, which is we don't talk about things around here.
Right. Or we just kind of, we just leave well enough alone, and maybe, if no one says anything, then I'm doing okay, and that's just not helpful, especially in a more turbulent, high, a more dynamic environment, maybe where things are changing a lot. You've got to have some real time feedback.
And we can't blame them. I mean, 38% of the effects are negative, so it behooves you to don't worry, there's hope. We'll get it to you by the end of the episode.
I hope so. Right. So a couple different pieces of this feedback environment or culture include things like the source credibility. Whether or not you view the supervisor who's giving you some feedback, or your coworker who's giving you feedback, whether or not you view them as credible. And that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. You just think about people, hey man, your .NET code stinks. Wait a minute, you don't even code.
You even code, bro? Yeah, it doesn't, it's not credible, right? Do you trust that person? Are they competent themselves? Do they even have any idea of what you do on a day-to-day basis, right? That's really important. So source credibility is part of it. The feedback quality, is it something that's specific? Is it something actionable that I can do?
Hey, Ben, why don't you stink less at your job? Okay,
okay.
How?
Right.
Or hey, you be more lucky next time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or change your attitude. You hear that sometimes, and it's like, okay, I hear you, but I don't really know exactly what I'm doing. So the feedback quality matters. Another piece is the feedback delivery. So, there's kind of the content piece about what you're saying, but also how you say things really matters, so that you're not building a wall of defensiveness with the person who you're trying to give that feedback to.
Right.
Because, we like to protect our own psyches. So when someone starts to tell us something perhaps negative about us or about our performance, it starts to kind of threaten our sense of competence and our sense of worthiness and so forth. So
right, and that actually depends on the feedback environment. Like if you have an active, we talk about stuff around here, and it's all cool, right? It has less of an impact on who you are, your identity issues, who you are as a person, and more like, oh, well, we need to do that. Think about sports teams that are strategizing how to win. Hey guys, we got to learn this new play to beat this type of team. Nobody feels offended. Oh man, we don't know that play. They're like, great, let's get into practice and start doing it. So, that feedback culture will matter how this stuff is perceived.
Right. So we talked about source credibility, the feedback quality, the feedback delivery. Another thing that matters and is part of this feedback environment is the perceived frequency of both favorable and unfavorable feedback. So oftentimes when we talk about feedback and performance at work, we oftentimes talk about how to deliver that constructive criticism, those areas for growth or whatever. But that's natural because that's kind of the tougher part of giving good feedback. But it's also important to remember that you got to give some feedback about what people are doing right, and you should do that at least as frequently as you're doing stuff. Talking to them about things that they're messing up.
Right.
You
don't just be a downer all the time. It's not cool. And if you can't think of positive things about people in your team, you might want to reflect on your own perspectives because there's always good stuff going on.
Right. And you got to get over this idea. Sometimes I run across this with folks where they're like, you know what, I shouldn't have to tell people they're doing a good job because, we pay them. And we show up, that's our thank you, we pay them. And I just think that is just, that's like, I don't know.
Yeah, you better add like a 40% premium over the industry standard to be.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to come here, but I hate it, so you got to pay me a whole lot more. And that's just like an.
I mean, that's the exact.
Century, yeah,
that's the exact opposite. I hate it here, so you got to pay me a lot more. That's like the mirror reflection of Which if an employee said like, "Hey, listen, I hate it here, so you need to give me a 40% raise," you'd be like, "What? Wait, what?" You know?
Hmm.
And that'd really be obtuse. But that's the same kind of thing. We don't have to give positive feedback because we pay people. It's the
Right,
same
right.
thing.
That's just a very 18th century way of thinking about management and leadership in my view.
Politely said, Ben. How 18th
So,
century of you.
yes.
Where's your wig?
Yeah. What year is it? So that's definitely part of it. The perceived frequency of both favorable and unfavorable feedback. Another piece is source availability. So whether or not you can actually find your gosh darn boss, or that person is around. One challenge that I come across when I talk with, for example, MBA students, and when I work with organizations, they oftentimes say, well, my supervisor is, located in Boston and I live in Cleveland, or something like that, right? And it can make it very challenging when you have these dispersed geographical situations. But I still think that there are ways that we can get around that. It just takes a little bit more ingenuity, a little bit more effort on probably both parts of that equation, to have that communication flow, right? We do have things called phones. We do have things, like
Video chat
chatting,
tools.
right?
And there's we're a global environment for
Yeah.
a lot of people in the workplace. This should not be,
Yeah.
we
I
can
mean,
overcome this challenge.
Exactly. So that's the source availability. And then the last piece of a feedback environment or culture is whether or not the sources of feedback, either supervisors or coworkers, actually promote feedback seeking themselves. So whether or not they, ask for feedback, kind of role modeling this behavior, and because that's part of this environment. Again, this runs contrary sometimes to people's implicit ideas around what leaders do, what leadership is all about. Because why should I ask my subordinates for feedback? Well, you know what? That's probably the most important source of feedback, really. Because they're the ones who you're trying to influence. So, that whether or not they promote feedback seeking is very important. It's part of this idea of feedback environment, feedback culture, and coaching.
Yeah, and I see lots of managers and leaders. They get so bogged down because they have strong deliverables that they've got to drive with the team, and a
Sure.
whole bunch of something, and they'll be sitting in, clicking away, or death by meetings is their normal Monday through Friday fare. And an employee comes in the office and says, "Hey, you got so and so. How am I doing? You're fine. Could you close the door, please?"
Mhm.
Right there, you've already started to curate like you're not interested in providing. So if you're a leader or follower, anybody within an organization, those times when there's a piece of feedback, pause and hone in. You're about to get some gold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very true. So let's turn now to our attention to a little bit about why this matters around this idea of feedback and feedback culture or feedback environment. And we've already kind of covered this first one. It's just it's simply critical. It's a critical piece for getting people to accept and use the feedback. It has to be part of the culture. It has to be part of the norms, part of the way that we just do things around here, in order for people to see this as acceptable and useful.
And it
Um,
doesn't have a huge emotional weight if you're just doing
mhm.
it all the time. Like
Yeah.
there's no emotional weight of going to get a coffee at the coffee machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there
Mm-hmm.
should be no emotional weight to feedback giving all over the place.
And one way in which I think that it can really start to have less of that emotional weight is if you have those high quality relationships being built beforehand. So for example, you and I, we work together on a daily basis, and I know that we have a good working relationship. And so if you give me a piece of constructive or negative feedback, like it's not going to affect me like it would if it's someone who I didn't really know that well.
Yeah, because I have
Because
no credibility. No.
right, no, but you actually you have a lot of credibility, and then this what I always tell my students, what I tell managers I'm working with is I tell them, look, if the person that you're going to give feedback to, if they before you give the feedback, if they know in the marrow of their bones that you value their contributions and care about their well-being, and then you give them the feedback, then they're not going to they're going to be a lot less defensive. right? Because that's it's like layered on top of this fundamental piece of trust that you've already built. So, another thing that they found in this study when they developed this measure of feedback environment in the article we already talked about, they found positive correlations between that and leader member exchange. So the quality of the relationship between the supervisor, very important. People's satisfaction with the feedback, probably even more importantly, their motivation to use the feedback, and
Right.
their and whether or not they seek feedback themselves. So I think that's some quantitative evidence to suggest that this is a good thing and a useful thing for any organization that's trying to have people flourish.
Right. We talk about all the time how you can't fake this stuff and really get anywhere. And
Yeah.
one of those rules of thumb, so to speak, or heuristics that you can use as an individual is you got to give a rip and be a person of character and integrity. So if you're a
Hmm.
manager who's not, right, you should be nervous about the feedback environment because you're, I don't know, you're like a Trojan horse. I just see somebody with a badly put in my mind's eye, right? I see somebody with a poorly done disguised sneaking
Mm,
behind enemy lines, right?
yeah.
That person's going to be super nervous because they're not, they kind of don't belong there, right? And so if you're a manager that's just pretending at these things, it's not going to work well. You're probably going to be in that 38% where feedback goes poorly.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but that being said, if you are a person of a character, if you are a person of heart that really cares, it'll cover a lot of your trips and inevitable, slips and falls along the way to doing this well.
Hmm. Hmm. And this is all part of what Paul Levy and his co-author Jane Williams, in a different article that was in the Journal of Management, they talk about this in terms of the social context of performance appraisal. And when we go back to the whole idea of formal performance appraisals, one thing we know that is really important is how the person who's being rated, the ratee, how they react to it. This is very important. The feedback environment, the culture, is key to all of this. And then the tools that we use, maybe some of the HR practices, this all matters as well. And I think we would argue that all of this around a feedback culture, a feedback environment, having people who coach each other on a regular basis, this is really important for the overall healthy functioning of any team or organization. But I would say particularly for those that are dealing in more ambiguous or uncertain types of environments.
Right. So I guess let's talk about what organizations can do to actually foster a feedback culture. Hey guys, we're sold. This sounds like a good idea. What do we do now?
Sure. So I think it's important for us to just very briefly re-examine kind of what is organizational culture. How does it change? Because if let's say this is not part of your current DNA in your organization, and you want that to become part of your organization's DNA, well, then you need to think about it in terms of how organizational culture changes. So listeners may want to review our episode that really focused specifically on organizational culture and what it is and how to change it. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But what's organizational culture, Chris?
Well, so it's a whole lot of things. And most people say, hey, what's a culture around here? And, it's what's kind of is it cool? Is it nice? There's actually some people who've done some in-depth research. So culture has to do with the values that we have as an organization, the stories that get told, frames, toolkits, categories of way we think about and talk about organization.
Right.
These things help us figure out what's appropriate and what's not around here.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at some startup and you come in a 3-piece suit and everybody else is wearing flip-flops and t-shirts, hey,
Yeah.
this guy didn't get the memo, right?
Reminds me of that episode of The Office where Jim walks in. He decides I think they have a new boss, and he decides he's going to wear a tuxedo to the office. And it's very, very funny, but it's kind of. It's exaggerating for illustrative purposes, but it's saying that culture helps us understand what is appropriate, what's the right thing to do around here, what's kind of expected and what's not expected in this organization. And this can vary a lot between different types of organizations.
Right. And, one of the things that you're generally concerned about when you come into a new organization, or if you're in an organization and just want to move up or into a different role, you got to know what being a good performer really means, or, on the how do I get a superior block checked on my performance review. So,
yeah,
people, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so a lot of times this is, there's kind of what is expected in the organization, and then how to get things done, right? Are we an organization in which people kind of make unilateral decisions about things, or is this an organization in which we really need to have attention to process and collaboration? Those are aspects of culture that are really important. And if you mess these up, you're going to find yourself not performing well.
Right. And, all these organizations will develop a type of personality. And you'll see that in the way, if you call into customer service at an organization, you can kind of get the personality of the organization if you have to interact with their support on a regular basis.
Right. And a lot of this has to do with, how people talk to each other, how they greet each other, the rituals they use to recognize key moments and so forth. And this is really important for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons that culture is so important, and I think feedback culture, feedback environment coaching all fits right in here, is this is critical for actually executing your strategy.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many CEOs or boards of directors have we sat with where they're just like, oh my gosh, we paid for this big strategy roadmap from McKinsey or whoever, and it's a great plan, but we just can't get any traction on this stuff, right? We're just spinning our wheels in the sand here. Sometimes culture is the biggest, gap in that, having a good strategy and actually getting it done.
Right. The management guru, Peter Drucker, apparently once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And, I think there's a little bit of truth to that. It's also important because these norms that you create in an organization, they can endure. These are things that get taught to newcomers. They get kind of woven into organizational practices. They can be very important for how you attract, how you select, how you retain people in your organization, and that can have an outsized influence on kind of the organization's performance and trajectory.
Right. And the norms enduring is what makes changing culture a full contact sport, right?
That's a good metaphor for it. And, a key part of having a good culture, because I think there are bad cultures. A key part of this is avoiding the toxicity that can sometimes come into cultures where, people are engaging in a lot of kind of politics and talking behind each other's back and gossiping and being, rude to each other and so forth. And coming back to what we're trying to do here with Indigo Together and with this podcast, this is a key part of human flourishing, having a positive, inclusive, type of culture in your workplace.
Right. So let's talk about how culture changes. Get into our episode. We do a deep dive on all that is culture change. But, what are some of the ways culture changes, Ben?
Well, so culture changes in a variety of ways. So I don't want to say there's one way in which culture changes because it's such a deep and complex thing. One way in which culture can change is it could be, and sometimes it is, through very small changes that add up over time. There's this great article that came out a number of years ago in the Academy of Management Journal talking about radical change accidentally, and how some small changes that maybe kind of happened at the grassroots level within the organization. They started doing some things differently, and it really started to spread like this really positive virus in the organization, and started to change the culture and what people actually did. So it can happen that way. It can also happen through more dramatic or intentional types of efforts. This has to be something that is, that you have some alignment among senior leaders on. It has to be something that is communicated. It has to be, a multi-year effort. Sometimes organizations will talk to us about organizational culture and they'll say, we want to change our culture. How can you help us do that in the next 60 days?
Yeah.
and is
we always think twice about those engagements, right?
Right, absolutely, we do. And the
there's
reason
no
is
magic
that
wand. There's no magic wand.
There isn't. I'm sorry to report that, but it's because any organization that has a certain culture, and every organization has a culture, that culture has developed, over time, and so any kind of change is going to take some time because people get very habituated to those ways of behaving and so forth. So I think one way that we can also think about organizational change is looking back at some ways in which leaders embed the culture and ways they enact the culture in their organizations. And, this comes from some great work from Edgar Schein, who's kind of a legend in this whole area, one of these scholars. And, part of this happens through, how you approach hiring, how you onboard people in your organization, what kinds of values you're teaching at those very early stages, and how you manage performance. That's very particularly relevant to today's episode with regard to feedback and coaching. Whom you promote, that really says a lot about what's important in the organization, don't you think?
Right. It's so key. Onboarding is not about getting your log on to your computer and getting an assigned office or cubicle or something, right? I mean, you got to do that part too, right? But, and especially for, managers, senior managers, director, VP, all the way up the chain, they'll focus on, okay, here's who you report to. This is what, you got to get this report out every Thursday. Here's HR. And they spend no time on the culture, helping marinate them in the culture and values of the org. And so that's some of that. If you have a whole bunch of managers, well, let me back. That's why nobody believes your value statement that you put on your website, right? And yeah, maybe one person, maybe the entrepreneur, founder, or CEO put something on there. And then they just rando hire a bunch of people and managers and wonder why isn't our culture aligned with our values? Well, you put a platitude on the wall. That's it, right? So when especially with managers, but especially with everyone, you gotta have this as part of your onboarding thing, because immediately they're going to start turning their attention and their eyes to, hey, how do I get on board and aligned with these feature process? Otherwise, you do get that radical change accidentally, because you just got whatever you got in the bag out of people you hired off of Indeed or whatever, Right.
So if you think back to, some of the more dramatic onboarding processes that you and I have been through, like in the military. I mean, you go through any kind of officer training or any kind of boot camp. That's a very intense experience, and you learn a lot. And it's very intentional in the military about, kind of what's appropriate, what's not, and how to interact with each other. And, so if you were going to, for example, look at this whole idea of feedback culture and coaching culture, it would probably need to start then, or at those very early stages, to really ensure that these types of ideas, these values, these skills are starting to be taught then. Because if you, allow someone to enter the organization and then progress through, and this is not part of what they do, and then imagine that, oh, well, now you've been promoted, let's turn the switch now and turn you into this, awesome feedback machine. It's not going to really work.
Right. And, if you've gone through one of those dramatic, intentional culture changing things and you actually got something going pretty good, every time you don't have an onboarding process that makes sure that you have that alignment, you're attacking that very thing that you spent so much time and tears developing, right?
Absolutely. Right. So, I think if we go back to what Edgar Schein talked about in terms of how you change culture, looking at some of the ways in which leaders embed culture into the organization. I think we can kind of look at how these may apply to the feedback culture, the feedback environment. So, some of these embedding mechanisms, how leaders react, for example, to organizational crises when things don't go right. I think about, for example, let's say, you have the after action review after, a project goes well or doesn't go well. How the leader really responds in that environment, that is huge for feedback environment. Because if the leader is not receptive to feedback, him or herself, or doesn't promote kind of an open conversation in that situation, then it's going to stifle the conversation. It's going to stifle the feedback and learning that really could occur.
Right.
I think there also just needs to be some very deliberate role modeling, teaching, and coaching around these things. Because if you're, trying to teach, for example, giving good feedback, being good coaching skills, this is more than just writing it down. You can write beautifully about it. And, what you always say to clients and stuff is you can hand someone a book on boxing, but that's different from being in the ring, And
right.
I think
You've got to have those role models, right? So you need to set up good role models in the org. You got to actually teach the stuff. And then there's got to be coaching that you got to take a multifaceted approach if you actually want to develop these kinds of things.
It does, yeah. So, another key mechanism is, how leaders recruit others, how leaders are selected, who gets promoted, who gets, excommunicated from the organization.
Right.
How you deal with those types of things. If you really want to value coaching and feedback, well, that should probably be part of your considerations, your criteria, when you're thinking about what performance looks like for your best leaders. It also has to do, with some of your systems and procedures, how you structure, for example, your formal performance appraisal system. You probably need to take into consideration how that either enables or constrains this idea of a feedback environment.
If you're bringing in a consultant to look at that, make sure they provide evidence-based citations for why they're changing your performance review.
I think that's very well.
I mean, everybody's got a system that they're peddling, but just say,
Yep.
great. What research is that based on?
Yes, that's very true. I think it's very important to embed any kind of ideas around feedback and coaching into your values, into what's expected of leaders, and then train them on it. Don't assume that people know how to do this. It's a fairly unusual thing in most organizations because we just haven't been, used to this idea of kind of feedback coming from many different directions. We may have those implicit ideas around what leaders do and what leadership looks like. So maybe we could walk now through some of those different aspects of the feedback environment that we already talked about and kind of suggest a few different ways in which organizations can change their culture based upon those. So starting with source credibility, what implication does that have for how organizations approach all of this?
Right. So, you got to build some trust. One of the ways a leader can do is knowing what your people do. And I've seen this in some of the larger enterprise organizations. The CEO comes out and says, "Hey, so what do you guys do around here?"
Yeah.
And that just leaves this bad impression. So even if you don't know, maybe get a brief from one of your, lieutenants on, "Hey, so what do these guys do again?" Right. So, but then that would be faking it. Right. So actually know what your people do is one way you can build some trust and credibility.
Sure. So in your leadership, your management training, I think emphasizing this idea of building trust, getting into the weeds and actually understanding what people do. Sometimes I think there's kind of an anti-micromanagement movement sometimes, right? Where it's like, oh, I don't want to get so involved in my people's business that they, think that I'm micromanaging them. Well, first of all, sometimes people do need to be micromanaged because they're not doing their work correctly. But let's set that to the side. Micromanagement is different from being interested in what people are up to, and actually understanding their challenges and establishing that rapport and that communication flow so that they feel willing to talk to you about how things are going and they feel willing to give you feedback and they're more receptive to it when you provide that feedback. So, that all goes into this idea of source credibility. And then there's this aspect of feedback quality, So you've got to give good feedback.
Right, right. Feedback quality means you have kind of a deep understanding of what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can't get feedback with any nuance if you don't have a deeper understanding. I've met some of these entrepreneur founders. I'm thinking of one guy named Dean that he's built a really large organization that's global, but he can go out and run any of the machines in any of his plants.
Wow.
Like he knows it cold. So, he can come in and just say, "Hey, Larry, why don't you take a 2-hour break, man? And I'm just going to run this machine for you for a couple of hours." And
it's amazing.
But when other people out on the factory floor see the stinking CEO like doing some, his feedback quality is really high because he understands every piece of the organization. Now, that's one extreme example, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like he knows the day to day of the factory. He knows why they plan and what their supply chain flow looks like and all that kind of stuff. So he's able to have super meaningful conversation. And that leads us to another thing. It's like how you deliver the feedback, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, one of the best models for this, I think, is to frame how you deliver feedback in terms of the situation. So, be very specific about kind of what the setting was for a particular behavior. So, situation, that's the first part. Then behavior comes next. Talking about something that you actually observed, right? This touches on both feedback delivery and feedback quality. Because when you start getting into the kind of hearsay about, oh, well, I heard this about you or whatever, that can be really tricky because people start to get very defensive there. But talk about things that you saw, some things you observed. So situation, the behavior, and then the impact. Talk about what were some outcomes of that. In the staff meeting yesterday, when you spoke up, even though no one else really was agreed with you, so that's a situation. And the behavior. That was amazing, right? I talk about the impact because it really helped to reinforce that we appreciate dissent in our team, right? So that's just an example of positive feedback using situation, behavior, and impact as a model. And that can be a good kind of framework for having these conversations. This needs to be trained, though. And I think this is another, as I said before, you can't just hand managers the book on boxing with this. This is something that is learned through doing. And, you can teach the principles in a classroom. You can help them understand kind of what's going on. But once they have to do it a number of times before they actually get good at it. And sometimes just providing that feedback and getting observed by somebody who's pretty good at it and getting some feedback about how you give feedback, that can be really helpful.
Right. That, you got to train it. And actually training the regular workers in your, it's not just managers. So if a new manager comes in and they start giving some feedback and the feedback's just garbage, and you're like, what is going on with this manager? I just want to come in and work and this guy's a yo-yo or whatever. You can say, hey, listen, let's shift this feedback and let's use the situation, behavior, and impact model here. So what was the situation again? Okay, and then what was the behavior you saw? And what was it? You can actually coach up and it'll help people, I think it's really important.
I think that's even more important than maybe you're emphasizing here. But just imagine an organization in which it's truly part of the DNA, the culture, in which people, regardless of their level, let's say they get some feedback and it's not framed in a good way or not helpful way, they have the chutzpah, they have the temerity,
training and tools. They've got the
training and tools, right? It's part of the culture, and they have this training and skills to then go to the manager and say, "Hey, really appreciate you're giving you some feedback. Can I help you out? I'd like to understand this a little bit more, and here's one way in which it can be really helpful for us." I just think that is a really productive way, and it's not like it's not done as like a slap in the face or a kind of a challenge to someone's authority, but it's done in a very helpful way. I just think that's amazing. So, that's part of this feedback delivery piece and kind of how you can start to change the culture there. Doing some training around these types of activities. And then, looking at favorable and unfavorable feedback. Part of the training also should include that, hey, this is not just about negative feedback. It's about
Right.
the frequency of both favorable and unfavorable feedback. Because we know that if you wait a long time before you give someone feedback, it just loses its relevance. If I you've been screwing this up for a year, but I thought I'd mention it now.
Right.
Gosh.
God, I see that all the time. It is.
Oh, it feels icky. It feels unfair, and people generally don't react well to that.
Yeah, and if you're doing that, stop.
Yep,
Give
absolutely.
feedback regularly, right? Which means don't hide in your office.
Yeah. So the
Right?
source of being available is very important. So another key piece of a feedback environment, as we already discussed, is source availability. So don't hide in your office. Get out there among your people. Have these meaningful conversations about performance. I sometimes even structural mechanisms like having a norm around, hey, we do after action reviews after different types of different maybe projects.
We delivered
or,
a project to a client.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what went well and what didn't go well, so we are more helpful to other clients.
Yeah,
Right.
so sometimes you see this in environments that are maybe using something kind of like Scrum, like this is kind of the retrospective, right?
You got it. And then, so as a supervisor coworker, do you promote feedback seeking yourself? Right?
Wait. You mean that as a manager, I actually have to change my behavior and I have to ask people for feedback too?
Well, I guess it depends on the culture, Ben.
Right. Yeah. And you can usually tell if someone's being honest about this. I want your feedback. I really use it. And then, the first time someone actually does it, you really need to have a good reaction to that and be appreciative of it, even if it's kind of off the wall or whatever. Because if you start to shoot the messenger on that, then guess what? You're not going to get any more feedback ever again. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
So, okay. So that's organizations. So kind of talk about what is a feedback culture. And we've talked about what can organizations do to shape and curate this. Now let's talk about the individual leaders within an organization. And individual leaders can be managers and they can be you and me, regular employees, right?
Sure. Because, the word leader and the idea of leadership is not something that is tied to a title, right? This
Right.
is,
And I also want to talk to the, if you're an executive or an HR or somebody with a large impact in the organization, realize that the leaders in the middle of the org can only do so much without your support, training, all those things that we talked about. Their hands are tied. So I know sometimes when we do individual executive coaching, they're like, okay, what can I do to change this? And if their hands are tied, if you're smart, you're not going to just struggle pushing a rock up a hill that is too heavy, So you've got to support this if you're HR or execs. Anybody with that large organizational impact needs to curate this. So anyway, let's go to, if you're an individual person, what can you do?
Sure. So I think the first thing that you can do, and this is all again around building that coaching feedback culture, that environment in which people can, give good feedback, and that it's something that is expected and supported and rewarded in the organization. The first thing is, work towards creating a team that is psychologically safe, right? Where people can take these interpersonal risks and say something that maybe isn't popular, and really make it an environment in which feedback is both expected and rewarded. So this will take some time because sometimes, especially depending on the current culture, it can be a big change. If you're the manager and you come into a situation where maybe this is not the norm, first time you ask for feedback, it may be like, wait, what? You want us to tell you something about your performance or something like that? But the first time people do it, you need to really recognize, hey, that's exactly, I really appreciate you telling me this. Let's talk about this further, et cetera, so that you can continue building that norm within the team.
Yeah, and if you've curated this norm and done a really good job, realize that other people that you hire into your organization, it may not have been an environment ever that had that, right?
Right.
So when you onboard them, like letting them see some feedback, like it happens all the time in a Scrum environment. Hey, so this is our retro and how it goes.
Mm.
Let people see some of those things and make that as part of their onboarding so they can feel okay when they're not used to that kind of psychologically safe place where feedback gets thrown around.
Another thing that you can do is really ask people for feedback on your own performance. This is helpful for two reasons. One, it's helpful because it may give you some information that's useful for you to improve how you lead the team. But it also is helpful because it helps you role model what other people should be doing. It's promoting that feedback seeking within the environment. And so, ask people for their feedback and really listen when they give it to you. Because that's very helpful. I'm reminded oftentimes of this one time that I got some great feedback. This was early in my military career. I was just a 22-year-old kid trying to run a team of electricians on a guided missile destroyer in the Navy, and I had a senior enlisted person. So he was junior to me in rank, but had been in the Navy probably about as long as I had been alive. He pulled me aside once and he said, "Hey, like, you're doing a great job. You're one of the best division officers I've had, but I want to give you some feedback on this one particular thing." And he proceeded to give me that feedback and said, "Part of your job is X, Y, or Z." And man, like, first of all, I didn't realize how good at delivering the feedback he was in the moment, because he didn't make me defensive. It was one of these things where I could tell it's coming from a good place. And he really wanted me to succeed. And he gave me this piece of advice and told me, something that I need to consider. And it really did change my approach. And I think, my reaction to that was like, "Hey, thanks a lot for telling me this. I really appreciate it." And then I did change my behavior based upon his feedback, and it was very helpful. So, asking for feedback and actually taking action is very important. And this goes to another point. I think, building that trust and credibility with your team is so important.
So people throw around this idea of like fixed mindset, growth mindset, and I've seen managers avoid doing the feedback because people never change. And that's just not true. People are always seeking to improve themselves. I mean, yeah, there's probably some stick in the mud that's not, but generally, even the ones that are playing the stick in the mud game, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they want to be in that broader cultural context, part of the team, part of the organization, those kinds of things. So feedback enables that growth in individuals. Maybe it won't be 100%, but it'll get you somewhere.
Right. Another thing that you can do is you could actually start to kind of change some things around the structure in your team, the way in which you meet, the things you talk about. And so you can institute and maybe even advocate for some of these structural changes or tools that can be really helpful. So, for example, the sprint retrospective, which is an opportunity for a team to come together and talk about how they can improve what they do. After action reviews, having these be mandatory, that can be helpful. Now, this does take some time, right, Chris, for it to be done well?
Yeah. So everybody thinks, the organizations will set up to where 100% of people's time are spent doing work or going to meetings about work.
Yeah.
They don't take time for training. They don't take time for onboarding. They don't take time for quality feedback. And so it doesn't really happen. And that's one of the things I like about the kind of Scrum liturgy, which is having that sprint review, sprint retrospective. It happens all the time. And eventually, if you have it set up and you as a leader insist that it happens every time, you may get some platitudes the first few times. "Oh, we could do better at throwing out our coffee cups," or something, right? Eventually out of boredom, people will start saying real stuff. But it'll be like dipping your toe into ice cold water, right? They'll do it okay, well, this really bothers me in our weekly or monthly work cycle. Maybe we could change this, or maybe this would be an improvement. And if that brings us to like the next thing, you got to actually act upon that feedback. Mm-hmm. So if somebody ventures something out there and you act upon it, well, that changes the culture and the paradigm. And eventually out of boredom, people start giving more stuff. And then it's not boredom. People are, seeking to improve actually.
Right. So another thing that you could do as an organization to help those, individual leaders is to provide some reading materials, provide some resources, some videos maybe about the literature on all of this. This can help you, it can help people within the organization all around you build a common understanding about what right looks like. It can help people understand this is the way in which we are going to act as an organization.
Right. Don't assume like knowledge or skill around this stuff. The communication is really hard. And if you want it to be done better, provide some training on this stuff. 38% is a horrible percentage for feedback to go negatively, right? You're trying, if somebody ventures actual feedback, they're trying to improve something or change something. So let's give everybody within the organization the tools to do this well.
Sure. And, if our podcast is helpful, maybe that's a resource for you and for other people in your organization. You may even like to listen, sometimes these performance conversations are difficult conversations. And so we have another episode that we recently did on difficult conversations, and we put a link to that in the show notes. But that might be helpful because it's definitely related to this idea of creating a culture, a climate, an environment that is conducive to high quality feedback coaching within the organization.
Right, Ben. So let me just recap. So today we talked about what is a feedback culture and why does it matter. We talked about what an organization can do to foster that feedback culture. And then we wrapped up with what individual leaders can do to foster that feedback culture.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.